Hello, everyone. Welcome. As you probably know by now, the theme of this year's Global Conference is Building Meaningful Lives. And we've tried to integrate that throughout the days of Global Conference. But one thing we're especially proud of is this session, where we have 3 different speakers talking about different aspects of how they've built meaningful lives and how they've integrated that into their own life and how they can help us learn to do that in our lives. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Shaka Senghor.
(1986). Age of 14, I ran away from an abusive home. First 2 weeks, I was basically homeless. I slept in garages, basements of friends, scrounged up food from the local grocery store. And before you know it, I found myself seduced into the crack cocaine trade. Within the first 6 months of selling crack cocaine, I experienced every imaginable horror that comes with that culture. My childhood friend was murdered. My brother was shot. I was robbed at gunpoint. And I was beaten nearly to death. I remember laying on this cold bathroom floor, asking myself this question: what kind of world do we live in where this happens to children? I never got an answer that made sense. Fast forward 3 years into the culture, March 8th, 1990, I wake up from a slight hangover. I was 17, don't judge me. And I remember getting up and saying to myself, I'm gonna go to the store and get some orange juice and some soup to kind of get my balance back. And I walked out of the house, and my friend was pulling up in his car, and he said, hop in. Instead, I said, how about we walk to the store? And we strolled down the street, and we stopped on the corner. We were chatting when a car began to roll up the street. It was a car with somebody in it that I didn't recognize as being threatening. But the closer the car got, I realized it was a guy I had a conflict with. Minor conflict, but conflict nonetheless. I thought it would be old school. He'll get out, we'll have an old school fist fight, live to see another day. Instead, he pulled out a gun and shot me multiple times. I was rushed back to my street when my friends called the ambulance, and the ambulance never came. Finally, my friend took me to the hospital where they rushed me in, extracted 2 of the bullets, left 1 bullet in, patched me up, and sent me home. Not one psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, or an adult asked me how I felt, what I thought, what I was experiencing. Not one adult thought to offer what I believe is the universal gesture of empathy and compassion, a simple hug. So instead, I returned to my community with this volatile cocktail of emotions. I was angry, I was bitter, I was frustrated, and more importantly, I was paranoid. So I began to carry a gun every day. And I began to tell myself this narrative that if I found myself in a conflict, instead of being shot, I would actually be the person doing the shooting. 16 months later, July 1991, at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, a car pulled up on my street as I was coming home. There was a guy in the car who I knew, and he wanted to make a drug transaction. And I refused to make that transaction on the grounds that he had brought 2 guys with him that I didn't know. That led to us getting into an argument. That argument escalated when threats began to get exchanged. And I remember this moment, reaching for a pistol and turning to walk away, when I heard what I thought was the car door opening. And in that instance, I turned and fired what turned out to be several fatal shots, tragically ending a man's life. I was 1 month into my 19th birthday. I was subsequently arrested, charged with open murder, and sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison for second-degree murder. When I stood in front of the judge, I knew in that moment that my life was over and that I would die in prison. But fortunately, I met some of the most incredible mentors on the inside. When I first entered prison, I was bitter, I was angry, and I found myself getting into more and more trouble. My security level was increased to maximum security. And within my first year, I found myself in solitary confinement for the first time. That was the beginning of a journey that I found myself on for the next several years. Fast forward, 1999, October, I catch another case in prison for an altercation with an officer. It led to me being sentenced to 2 additional years in prison and what turned out to be 4.5 years in solitary confinement. 23-hour lockdown in a cell that's about the equivalent of this space right here. So for 4.5 years, this was my world. And I can honestly tell you that when I first went to solitary confinement, it was by far the darkest moment in my life. The level of mental instability, the level of mental illness, the level of human torture is unimaginable. But I experienced that reality for 4.5 years straight. But it was also in that reality that I found a deeper purpose and found meaning in my life. And it came in a form that was so surprising to me that sometimes it still blows my mind to this day. It came through literature. See, I was fortunate. I was one of the lucky ones. When I went to prison, I could actually read. So I had access to information and words that challenged me to think differently. And I read everything from philosophy to world history, political science, but it was philosophy that was the most intriguing. Now, I'm a guy from the hood, and typically philosophy and the hood don't go together. But I found a way to make it work. I remember getting Plato's Republic and started reading the cave allegory, and I realized that if I just changed the names and changed the environment, that the philosophy would make sense. So it went from dialogues between Socrates and Glaucon to dialogues between Socrates and Tyrone. And instead of the cave allegory, it became the basement allegory. But it was in that environment that I began writing and nurturing myself back to health. Fast forward 2004, I'm released from solitary confinement. I get out, and I begin this path and journey as a writer. And writing for me, was therapeutic, it was healing, and it allowed me to think about the meaning of life in a deeper and different way. And so I wrote up some manuscripts, and I typed them out on this big thing called a typewriter, which we no longer use. And I began this journey to get my works published. And I realized that our dreams are best served when we actually put forth the effort to make them come true on our own. 2008, I published my first book from prison. I went up for parole for the first time, and I got denied after a minute interview. In fact, they told me that they didn't believe that I was prepared for society. I said, fair enough, I wasn't a model guy when I was first in, so I took that. Fast forward 2009, I go up for my second parole board hearing. Much better parole board hearing. Parole board lady comes in, she's beautiful, attractive, she's flirting, I'm flirting. I'm like, I'm going home, feeling good. And then they denied me a second time. And it was devastating to my family. And I decided I wasn't going to the parole board again. But they convinced me to go back that third time. And on June 22nd, 2010, after 19 years in prison, I walked out of prison a free man for the first time. Now, as you can imagine, after being gone for 2 decades, I came out to a very different world. But on my way out, here's what happened. We were preparing to walk out the door, and they handed us this bag. In the bag, there were some papers that we had to sign saying we would never carry a firearm or we risk going back to prison. There was another paper just talking about our health and everything that we needed to do to check up and get our ID. And then there were 3 condoms. Why 3 condoms? I'm not sure. But I guess somebody was thinking about us having a great first night home. So on the way out, I have this little bag, and the officers are saying, hey, good, welcome back to freedom. We'll see you back in 6 months. See you back in 6 months. Now, initially, I was angered, but then I thought about it. 70% of the men and women who get incarcerated end up back in prison within the first year. So the officer wasn't being mean, he was playing the odds. But here's what actually happened. I walked out and knew I had a responsibility to my community. And so I started a mentoring program in the city of Detroit and 2 high schools. And for that work, I won what's called the Black Male Engagement Leadership Award in 2012, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. I followed that up with a fellowship to MIT Media Lab, where I worked on a project called the Tolman Project, which was nominated for a Global TED Prize, even though they said I would be back in 6 months. I began teaching at the University of Michigan. I don't have a PhD, a master's degree, associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. I have a GED, and I showed up to work with flat kicks, as you can see, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. I ended up with a fellowship at Kellogg that I just wrapped up after 3 years. In 2014, I did a talk at TED's 30th anniversary that was nominated one of the top talks of that year, even though they said I would be back in 6 months. In 2015, I won Manchester University Innovator of the Year Award, even though they said I would be back in 6 months. In May of 2015, I got a phone call from an unknown number, and because I'm an entrepreneur, I always answer unknown numbers. And the woman on the line said, hey, Shaka, are you available at the end of June? And I was like, I think my calendar is flexible. And she said, okay, and hung up. And I was like, wow, this is a crazy call. Next day, she followed up and said, hey, Shaka, I'm so sorry. This is Andrea. I apologize for hanging up abruptly, but I was calling to see if you're available at the end of June because Oprah Winfrey would like for you to come to her home in Hawaii for an episode of Super Soul Sunday. I said, well, you know, I might can fit that in my schedule. Might can work some things out. I went on to do this interview with Oprah that she named not only one of the best in her career, but one of the best in her life the following month, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. March 8th, 2016, 26 years to the day I was shot, standing on that corner in Detroit, Michigan. My memoir debuted on the New York Times bestseller list, even though they said I would be back in prison in 6 months. Now, why do I share all these accolades? Is it to brag? A little bit. I believe you gotta celebrate yourself sometime. But I share this because in order to live a meaningful life, you have to make a commitment. You have to wake up every day with intention and with purpose. You have to write a narrative for yourself that honors who you are. You have to understand your value. You have to understand the relationships that you develop with people that are around you. And in order to do that, it takes consistency. See, when I ended up in prison, it's because I consistently lived in a negative form of thinking. And once I adapted to a more purposeful mode of thinking, I realized that I could live a much more meaningful life by welcoming the idea that intention, purpose, and commitment can produce different outcomes. That's how you live a more meaningful life. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaka. I want to mention that the copies of Shaka's book, Righting My Wrongs, are available for purchase in our bookstore here, as are books from both of our next 2 speakers. We have a lot of book signings today. Those will be taking place after the session is over, but people who want to buy a book, you might do that a little early just so we don't get a bunch up at the queue for the books. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Arianna Huffington.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shaka, for this amazing speech. Shaka and I met each other on Saturday, coincidentally, but there are no coincidences. You know, coincidences are the miracles that God performs anonymously. And that was such a miracle. And I just really felt that meeting Shaka and hearing his story firsthand was so incredibly aligned with my thinking at the moment and with everything I wanted to say today. So I'm thrilled to be here. I have to explain that for those of you who have not heard me before, this accent is for real. I was born in Greece. I tried hard to change my accent. It never worked. I finally relaxed when I met Henry Kissinger, and he said to me, "Stop worrying about your accent in American public life. You can never overestimate the advantages of complete and total incomprehensibility." So right now, I believe that we are at this amazing inflection point where the incredible acceleration of technology in our lives has meant that we need to make a decision. Are we going to keep running away from ourselves, which is what technology and social media make so incredibly easy, or are we going to celebrate technology and all the new innovations of augmented reality and virtual reality, while also connecting with our augmented humanity? I really believe this is an existential moment where if we don't do that, we are lost. Because as Shaka's story amply demonstrates, what allowed him to connect with himself was ultimately solitary confinement. He did not have screens, he did not have Instagram, he did not have Facebook, and he did not have Snap. He did not worry about how many likes the salad he ate for lunch got. He did not spend a lot of time staging the perfect bikini picture, although that would have been great to see. So he read philosophy, he meditated, he slept, he reconnected with his essence. And as Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, the line between good and evil cuts through each man's heart. And right now, it's never been easier to run away from what Archimedes called that center in us. He said, "Give me a place to stand, and I can move the world." And every religion, every philosophy in different language says the same thing. Every human being has a place, a center of peace, wisdom, strength. No human being lives in that place all the time, unless you are a saint. So most of us are constantly going in and out of that place. The question is, how quickly can we course correct? And it's never been harder to course correct for two major reasons. The first is that ever since the Industrial Revolution, we started looking at human beings like machines. And what is the goal of machines? The goal of machines is to minimize downtime. But human beings, the human operating system, is not like a machine. Downtime in the human operating system is not a bug, but a feature of the system. Just look at the myth of creation. When God created heaven and earth, it took 6 days. And then she took the 7th day off. Didn't really need to do that. After all, God is omnipresent and omnipotent. But God was sending us a message which we have completely ignored. Wherever you go, you have people bragging about how they sleep 3 hours, or they are up for 24/7, or they answer texts in the middle of the night. This is not something to brag about. This shows you are not building a meaningful life, period. And increasingly now, this is what is exciting, we are in the middle of this zeitgeist, where people are reevaluating these choices. Because as you're going to hear from my great friend Deepak, it's all about the choices we make. It's all about making conscious choices. I did an Instagram recently where I wrote that staying home over the weekend, missing a party, my childhood punishments have become my adult ambitions. And it got to this amazing amount of virality because people related to that. The other reason why it's been so hard to connect with ourselves is because of this addiction to technology. There was a fascinating study recently done by Harvard and the University of Virginia, where they brought people in and they gave them a choice. Do you want to spend 15 minutes by yourself without technology, or do you want to receive electric shock? And 67% of men chose electric shock. Among the wiser sex, women, 25% chose electric shock. Just imagine what would have happened to these people if they were in solitary confinement like Shaka. 15 minutes. But this is what is happening. It's becoming harder and harder for us to be alone, and yet the biggest problem in the world right now in terms of mental health is isolation. Depression has been declared by the World Health Organization the biggest health problem. Among teenagers, mental health problems, depression and anxiety are on the rise. So we are now at this incredible inflection point where we need to reconsider our choices. If I ask everybody here how much battery is remaining on your smartphone, you would know approximately how much. When 10 years ago, which is when my journey started, not as dramatic as Shaka's, I collapsed from exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and burnout, and broke my cheekbone on the way down. If you had asked me, Arianna, how are you that morning, I would have said fine. Because I had forgotten what being fine really was. I had gotten so used to running on empty. I had gotten so used to being permanently exhausted and thinking, well, that's what I had to do in order to succeed and build the Huffington Post, etc., that it took me that episode for me to look at my life again and reevaluate and ask the questions as I was lying on the floor in my own pool of blood and nobody had shot me, is this what success looks like? And then ask the question, what is success? You know, the philosophers that Shaka mentioned did not talk about success. They talked about the good life, which today we could say a meaningful life. Now we have shrunken the definition of the good life down to the successful life, and we have shrunken the definition of a successful life down to two metrics, money and status/power. And this is like trying to sit on a two-legged stool. Sooner or later, you fall off. The third leg of the stool starts with our own well-being. It's like they say on an airplane, put your own oxygen mask first. That doesn't make us selfish. That makes us better at everything else, being a parent, being a spouse, being a worker in any field at all. Wisdom, that place of wisdom that's in us, we're getting further and further away from it. Just look at our leaders. We are drowning in data and starved for wisdom. Data is not wisdom. Wonder, you know, the opportunity to really wonder at the mystery of the universe is passing us by because we think in order to be hyper efficient, we need to be multitasking, even though all neuroscience is telling us there's nothing more inefficient than multitasking. It's actually the most stressful thing we can do because our brain can only do one thing or another at a time. And yet, until I realized all these things, I don't remember ever walking down the streets of New York without either looking at my phone or being on the phone. And the first time I stopped doing that, I looked around, and I remember seeing this amazing building very near the place where I live in Soho, and saying to the friend I was with, wow, this building is gorgeous. When did it go up? And she said, 1920. So I'm thinking, what else am I missing? And why are we taking better care of our smartphones than we take care of ourselves? And why 70% of people sleep with their phone? If not in bed with them, on their nightstand. If your excuse is that you need it for an alarm clock, Pottery Barn has some great analog alarm clocks for $32 that look very pretty on your nightstand. At Thrive Global, my new company, we launched a charging station that looks like a little phone bed, and you can put all your phones there, tuck them in under the blanket, say goodnight to them, and reunite with them in the morning. And the reason we did that is because we all learn through ritual. And everybody here who is a parent of teenage children knows the problem. I was sitting next to a friend who runs a big advertising agency at a dinner the other night. And she literally started tearing up. She said, I can't communicate with my daughter anymore. It's as though her phone is in glorious Technicolor and I'm in black and white and I can't compete. So we need to start educating our children that there is something in them worth connecting with. And that from that place, when they are connected to that place, no matter what happens in their lives, they will be more resilient, wiser, and stronger. Because just think of it, we can't overprotect our children. We don't know what's going to happen. My oldest daughter, in her 4th year at Yale, got involved in drugs. I got the call every parent dreads. The ride to New Haven emergency room, I will never forget. She's now been sober for 5 years. Today is her birthday. And so her story had a good ending. But we see that all around us. And often what drives people to this behavior is stress, absence of meaning, fear. We need to have these tough conversations and help our children in the middle of the chaos of our lives, in the middle of constant buzzing, notifications, social media, connect with that essence that we all have. If we didn't have it, it wouldn't matter how much our lives were invaded by technology. But we do have it. And it's worth taking a little time, even if you're not in solitary confinement, to connect with that place. Because once again, as Thich Nhat Hanh said, it's never been easier to run away from ourselves. And, you know, there's a big difference between our eulogies and our resumes. If anybody has been in at a memorial service recently, you know that you've never heard anybody say, you know, George was amazing. He increased market share by 1/3. We are always memorialized about the other things, the little things, how we made people feel, what value we added to people's lives. And it's worth remembering that, not in order to be morbid, but because, as the Onion headline put it, death rate holds steady at 100%. And every philosopher used to talk about that. Socrates famous said, practice death daily. Again, not out of morbidity, because it puts everything in perspective. You don't sweat the small stuff. And in the face of death, everything really is small stuff. And Romans used to carve memento mori, remember death, on trees and on statues, again, for the same reason. So it is wonderful that this conference is called Building Meaningful Lives. For me, it's a part of the zeitgeist. And in my own story, just to end with that, ever since April 7th, 2007, when I collapsed, I became more and more interested in this. I studied the latest science, and I realized that the latest science is validating ancient wisdom. I wrote my book, Thrive. Then I wrote The Sleep Revolution. And I realized that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And that's when I took the tough decision in September to leave the Huffington Post, even though for me it's like a third child. that I gave birth to and ran for 12 years, and launched this new company, Thrive Global, because I want to help people through our media platform see how we can live our lives differently, to disrupt the way we work and live. And what we're doing, and I'd love to invite you to tell us your stories, is really create new role models. Have people who are successful, people who are in the arena, tell us how they do it differently. Like Jeff Bezos writing a piece, and the headline is, "Why am I sleeping 8 hours a night is good for Amazon shareholders." Making the connection between being fully recharged and making wise decisions, which is what leadership is about. Or Selena Gomez writing about how she takes regular digital detoxes. So people who admire her and won't hear it from me or Jeff Bezos can hear it from her. And you never know. Write your story, whether it's a story of burnout or micro steps that you are taking to course correct and reconnect with that part of ourselves, because you never know who is going to read it, who is going to see it and be affected by it. My email is very simple, ah@thriveglobal.com. And did I lose you? No, I can hear you. And let me just end by saying that I have a little saying on my desk that says, life is a dance between making it happen and letting it happen. And when we connect with that, we can connect with that essence in us and live our lives with more grace, more gratitude, more creativity, and yes, more love. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arianna. Again, the copies of her book, both Thrive and The Sleep Revolution, are going to be available for her to sign in the bookstore after this session. So, as our final speaker, I'm so honored to introduce Deepak Chopra. Deepak?
I don't need that. Okay, thank you, Shaka, and thank you, Arianna. I think from Shaka we heard how human consciousness, the human spirit, is infinitely flexible no matter what your conditioning is. And then from Arianna, that we are at a crossroads right now where we could face the next sixth extinction, or perhaps we could harness our collective intention, creativity, and imagination to create a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. So what I'd like to do actually is, in very short time that we have, take you through a history of human evolution. We are the latest experiment in evolution. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, which means the wise ones, which is a name we gave to ourselves. And this evolution has been going on for a long time. And what I want to share with you is a little description of how consciousness, mind, brain, body, and cosmos are a unified activity. Consciousness, mind, brain, body, and the universe are a unified activity. So first of all, what is consciousness? Consciousness is that in which all experience occurs. Right now you're having an experience in consciousness, not in your brain. Your brain is recording in electrochemical activity the experience, but your experience itself is happening in consciousness. So consciousness is that in which all experience occurs. It is also that in which all experience is known. Consciousness is the knowing element of experience. You know that you're having an experience. And finally, it is out of which all experience is made. So consciousness is the ground of being, and I'll give you an experience in a little bit, from where all experience occurs. There are two kinds of experiences we have. One is called mental experience, which is the experience of sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. And the other is called a perceptual experience, which is sense perceptions, which are also an activity of our consciousness. And sense perceptions give us the experience of a body, of a perceptual object that we call the brain, and then of the world. The universe is an experience in our consciousness. So with the help of one of my colleagues, we created this diagram which basically shows that at the top level is consciousness, and that everything that we call a mind-body interaction is actually an activity first in the brain, and then through these networks, it influences everything that's happening in your body. No experience goes unrecorded in the brain. No experience goes, whether it's a mental experience, emotional experience, cognitive experience, perceptual experience. There's no experience that goes unrecorded in the brain, and there is no record in the brain that does not influence what's happening in the body. So let's come back to that diagram for a moment. You can see these networks of self-regulation that are happening in your body as a result of both mental, emotional, and perceptual experiences. And you can see this includes almost everything that's happening in your body. The vagus nerve going to the heart, influencing heart rate variability, going to your voice box, influencing the tone of your voice, going to your facial muscles, influencing your facial expressions, going to your abdominal organs, and through the microbiome, influencing immunomodulators, which affect mood, and chemicals like opiates and serotonin and oxytocin and dopamine. It's one system. And that one system exists in you as a conscious being. So what Shaka did very elegantly, in a moment of recognition of his own being, he literally rewired his brain. And now we know that this rewiring of the brain actually is accomplished through emotional connections, first with our own self and then with each other. We have 3 brains that have evolved over about 500 million years. So the first brain that we have is called the reptilian brain, which is found in only reptiles. And if you go next to a reptile and you make a sudden noise or a sudden movement, the reptile will attack you or it'll run away. It's called the startle response. And what we call stress today is an exaggerated startle response. We react automatically through conditioned responses into basically fight or flight or fear or freeze. I remember when I was in medical school, the way we remembered the functions of the reptilian brain were the 4 Fs: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and reproduction. So those are still the dominant activities of humankind. But the second part of our brain is the limbic brain. It's called the emotional brain. And this limbic brain is only found in mammals. Mammals are so called because of the word mama, which means breast, mammary, mother. And so mammals, unlike reptiles, they don't lay eggs, they make babies. They nurse their young, and they create emotional bonds through something called limbic resonance. So when a baby looks at its mother initially and then at others, what the baby is watching is her eyes. Are they friendly or not? Is she looking at the baby or not? Watches facial expressions. Is she smiling or is she grouchy? Watches body language, hears the tone of her voice, and all the baby is looking for is attention, which means being heard, affection, being cared, appreciation, being noticed, and acceptance, just being loved for what it is, not for what it will do. And if that interaction is healthy, then you have a healthy emotional brain. And as we get older, this influences everything that happens in our life. In fact, the first few years of life influence everything that happens later in life in our emotional world. And if you look at this slide, you'll see that our moods, our brain networks, our hormone levels, our heart rate, our immune function, our biological rhythms, sleep-wake cycles. You know, sleep is where our genetic clock links with the circadian rhythms of the earth and the rhythms of the cosmos, as does meditation. Sleep-wake cycles, our dreams, our digestive processes. There's not a single activity in your body that is not influenced by your emotions. And of course, emotions occur in relationship with other people. You don't have emotions. Of course, you do have emotions like the one you had in solitary confinement, but those were actually a reaction to not being in relationship. So the great wisdom traditions have said to us since time immemorial that the separate self does not exist. What we call me and the other is inextricably woven through the web of relationship. So here's a slide that shows you basically these three brains, okay? The reptilian brain, which basically is only responsible for survival. The emotional brain, which is when it is dysfunctional, it leads to everything from broken marriages to havoc in our social relationships, our personal relationships, our relationship with the planet, our relationship with everybody else. In fact, everything that we can think of, from greed, insecurity, social violence, consumption, war, terrorism, is all linked to the anxiety and hostility and the guilt and depression that follows lack of connection with other beings. What is anger but remembered pain of separation? What is fear but the anticipation of pain again in the future? What is guilt, blaming yourself, or shame, being blamed by others so you feel humiliation? What is depression? It's the depletion of all the energy as a result of being disconnected. So being disconnected emotionally with other beings is the #1 cause of what is happening in our world today. The third part of the brain is the cortical brain. Now, just to put this in perspective, the reptilian brain is 300 to 500 million years old in evolutionary time. The limbic brain, or the emotional brain, is about 100 million years old. And the cortical brain, which is the one we are proud of, is only 4 million years old. So human beings might pretend to be creatures of rationality, but they're bristling with emotion, and they're bristling with the survival instinct. And what has happened now in our society is that the limbic brain, the reptilian brain, and the cortical brain are not integrated. And the cortical brain evolved very rapidly when we started to speak. When we started to speak in language, when we started to write, our cortical brain grew explosively, especially when we started to create constructs and stories about relationship. So when we create constructs and stories as a result of relationship, our cortical brain actually grows. And today science is showing us that through contemplative techniques such as meditation, mindfulness, self-inquiry, transcendence, we can actually rewire the brain for higher consciousness. So what I'm going to show you here is, don't be scared by this word, enlightenment. Enlightenment simply means to be in the light of self-awareness. It's the highest intelligence, is to be aware of yourself, to know who you are. And if you don't know who you are, if you're not intimate with your innermost being, then it's impossible to have a relationship with anyone else. So before I go into these techniques, what I want to do with you is a little experiment, with your permission. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I request that you say yes as the answer. Okay? And say it a little enthusiastically. So no, I haven't asked the question. So the question is, are you aware? Yes. I'll ask it again. Are you aware? Yes. Okay, now I'm going to ask you the same question, but this time don't answer it till I raise my hand. Agreed? And then enthusiastically say yes. Of course you're aware, you're listening to me, right? So, are you aware? Are you aware is a thought. Yes is a thought. You are not your thoughts, you're the awareness in which thought arises and subsides. You're not your perceptions. Perceptions arise in the same way of thought, in awareness, subside in awareness. Who you are is the source of perception and thought. And that is what yoga is about, by the way. Yoga, if you read the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, you'll see the first line is yoga, which means union, yoke. It's the same word as the English word yoke, as when Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That is connecting to the source of your own existence, which is the source of all existence. So, I'm going to ask you the same question, are you aware? And this time, don't answer it at all, just slip into awareness. Are you aware? And what you're experiencing right now is your innermost being, which is not a thought. A thought might be saying, I wish I'd gone to the bathroom before the lecture, or what am I going to have for dinner? See, awareness is prior to thought. It's where thought arises, subsides, where thought is born, where perception is born, where all experience is born. So now I want you to understand one more thing, and if you do, it'll be your ticket to freedom. So Arianna mentioned death. So death is happening all the time. Experience is born and it dies in every moment. Okay, what we experienced 5 minutes ago is dead. What you experienced this morning is gone. What happened to last night? What happened to a minute ago? What happened to a second ago? It's gone. And even as I speak to you, by the time information gets to your brain and you begin to actually have the experience of listening to me, it's over. That's why the great German philosopher, Wittgenstein, he said, we are asleep. Our life is a dream. But once in a while, we wake up enough to know that we are dreaming. And so when you go about looking at all the activity everybody is doing automatically, bundles of conditioned reflexes and nerves constantly being triggered by people and circumstance into predictable outcomes, you see they're all sleepwalking. And sometimes the dream turns into a nightmare, which it is right now in the zeitgeist. Having not woken up to the presence in which experience is born and dies, we are living in a waking dream. And we frequently turn it into a nightmare. And then when the nightmare gets colossal, reaches critical threshold, then you have what we have today. An unsustainable planet, war, terrorism, eco-destruction, extinction of species, poison in our food chain, and now risking our own extinction. That's why what Arianna said is so important right now. This is the moment to literally wake up. And what we wake up to is the presence of being, not thinking, Yes, feeling love, compassion, joy, equanimity, looking for meaning in the form of goodness, truth, beauty, evolution, creativity, conscious choice making. When we wake up to the presence, then this is a natural byproduct of our being. What Plato called, or other people called after Plato, Platonic values. These are divine attitudes that spontaneously emerge from our being. So what I want to share with you in the last few minutes is what we can look forward to if we do wake up to the presence of our own being. And before we do that, can you please turn your attention again to that which is listening right now? If that becomes the center of experience, there's no such thing as stress. Okay, stress is the perception of thought, and stress is the perception of a threat, which is the movement of thought, which leads to separation. In this moment, there is no stress. In your being, there is no stress. It's totally okay. And all you have is now. If you're constantly planning for a future, when you finally arrive at it, if you're not present now, you won't be present for it when it finally arrives. So what's the point? So here are some things we can do to rewire our brain for higher consciousness. Let's have this step. Reflective self-inquiry, finding your purpose. Okay, so what I want you to do is right now, close your eyes for a moment, please. Put your awareness in your heart, if you will, and mentally ask yourself, who am I? Allowing any sensation, image, feeling, or thought to come to you. Who am I? And now mentally ask yourself, what do I want? What do I really want? Allowing any sensation, image, feeling, or thought to spontaneously come to you. What is my purpose? Allowing any sensation, image, feeling, or thought to come to you. Finally, what am I grateful for? Allowing any sensation, image, feeling, or thought to come to you. Gratitude opens the door to abundance consciousness. In fact, gratitude is the key to everything else. Finding your purpose and fulfilling your deepest intentions. So, please open your eyes. I would like to take the remaining 3.5 minutes to show you what else we can do. If you want to not be ruled by your reptilian brain, then just stop. Once in a while, when you're overshadowed by what's happening, observe your reaction to react before you react. Stop, take 3 deep breaths, observe what's happening in your body, and then proceed with awareness and compassion. That's how you override the reptilian brain. If you can have that, that's how you override the reptilian brain. Stop, observe, decouple automatic behavior. You then rewire your emotional brain by focusing on divine attitudes, what the Buddhists call gratitude, loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. That becomes the motivation for everything that you do. Because if you're not increasing and expanding the experience of happiness in your life and others, then what's the point? Success has to be redefined as the progressive realization of worthy goals, the ability to love and have compassion, and finally, to get in touch with the creative center of our being, which is the creative center of this universe. So that's how you activate your limbic brain. And then these days we hear so much about mindfulness, which by the way is an incorrect word because you're not using your mind, you're being aware. You're being aware even of the mind. Okay, so that is non-judgmental awareness of external and internal world. And a new word I want to introduce to you, interoception, to know what's going on in the wheel of your own awareness, in your body, in your internal organs, in mental space, in the web of relationship. Transcendence, to once in a while, to settle into that state of being which has no subject-object split. Metacognition. Metacognition is a word that is slowly creeping into the literature, the literature of spiritual intelligence. Metacognition is the ability to observe yourself having a sensory experience and the ability to observe yourself making a choice. In the words of the great teacher Krishnamurti, who was, Arianna's mother, was a great friend of ours, mine too. She and I met because of our common friendship with Krishnamurti, and he said something very beautiful. He said the highest intelligence is the ability to observe yourself without judging yourself. That's what metacognition is. Observing yourself having an experience, this, right now, this moment, and also making conscious choices. If you do that, then the wisdom traditions tell us we wake up to our soul. And that's the first step in higher consciousness, soul consciousness. To be aware of yourself as the witnessing awareness in which all experience arises and subsides. And the recognition that experience is in time, but you, the awareness, are not in time. Birth and death are in time, but you, existence, awareness is not in time. And as we wake up to that and we abide in that, and that becomes an experience in waking, dreaming, and sleeping, that in wisdom traditions is called cosmic consciousness. To be in the world and not of it. To be here and yet to know that this is a temporary vacation from a much grander experience of spirit. Teilhard de Chardin said, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. You could say we are non-local beings having a local experience, same thing. And when we become aware of the same silent witnessing awareness in others, that's called divine consciousness. And finally, unity consciousness, where we recognize that the awareness in me and the awareness in you is the same awareness. Right now, I'm experiencing this, you, and all this in the same awareness that you are experiencing, your body, mind, me, and this. There's only one awareness. We are that awareness, and the universe is its manifestation. That's why you are the universe. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. His book, You Are the Universe, also available for sale in the bookstore. I'd like to ask everybody to thank all three of our fantastic speakers today, Shaka Senghor, Arianna Huffington, and Deepak Chopra. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.